I used to do a lot of like performance art. And I think those things also feed into the way that I engage with any text to sort of, feel the character and feel their journey and story. Sort of, read out the text aloud to myself and think of, okay, what is the tone that I am using to say this particular dialogue, and how do I, convey the same tone when I read this thing out in English? So it's a very embodied process for me, at least in some ways.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Afterword Voices in Translation podcast. This podcast celebrates the art of literary translation, exploring its joys and challenges while highlighting the often invisible work of translators across India and the world. It celebrates literary translators and places their craft firmly in the spotlight. I'm your host, Mohini Gupta, and I'm excited to bring to you very exciting journeys in translation across languages with every new episode. Today, our guest is Ipsa S, the translator of Sangeeta Bandyopadhyay's Bengali work Guptothon, which was recently published as Hidden Treasure in English. This was published by Zuban Books under the Women Translating Women project in collaboration with the Ashoka Center for Translation and the Sushambedi Memorial Fund. Ipsa is a teacher and translator with an MA in English and Gender Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Their research explores urban spaces and queer bodies in speculative fiction. While the rigor of academia leaves little time for creative work, they continue to pursue poetry shuttling between two continents. Their writing has been published by the International Journal for Comic Art, Zuban, Blaft, and Penguin India. Thank you so much, Ipsa, for making time to speak to us on this podcast. And without any more time wasted, I'm just going to dive into the episode. Once again, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to start with just a very fundamental question about where your journey with translation began. Of course, we are bilinguals, multilinguals, and we're constantly translating in our heads. But where did it really start for you, this sort of engagement with literary translation? And how does it also interact with your other roles that you play in your everyday life or your work as a teacher? So if you can talk to us a little bit about the role of translation in your life, and then we'll move on.
Thanks for having me again, Mohini. And I think this is a question that I think is really important to start with, given that I I think I have grown up with translation around me, but I only realized that it has been all around me much later when I actually got into the process of doing formal literary translation. Because as a child, I used to read all kinds of books, just English books, but also books in Hindi, Bengali, and often the same book in multiple languages. In fact, I think that the first ever like children's book that I read was a book in translation. Like my mother used to get me these Russian children's literature books from the book fair that happened in Calcutta every year. And that is my first memory of reading a book, actually, where there was this one story that I read across three languages, and my mother got those three books in Hindi, Bengali, and English because she wanted me to learn all three languages. Um, but I obviously did not think of it as a thing, and obviously the translator at that point was something so invisible to me, or just something so obvious about a book of that sort, that you don't even really think about the work that goes into it. But my process of sort of consciously learning how to translate and thinking of it as a process began in college, because I was doing my bachelor's in Ashoka University, and I was doing a minor in creative writing at that time. And we have courses in translation that are offered out of the creative writing minor over there. And so I started doing some translation with Professor Arunava Sinha as my mentor, and then with like a cohort of other people who were also translating. But this was all happening over the pandemic, which brought its own dimension to things, I think, because it is one thing, I think, to, speak to one another when you're in an in-person setting. And we often used to do a lot of translation exercises in that class, such as, okay, we'd get this like paragraph or this conversation that professor would give to us and would be like, okay, how would you render this in English? Like imagine that your parents are talking in like your whatever your native tongue is. How would you render this in English? And all the difficulties of doing that, like, when I am speaking to somebody face to face or in front of them, there are many other ways in which I can use my body language and everything to bring that thing forward. But it felt like there was this like added veneer of translating that was involved that we had to do over Zoom during that pandemic period. So in many ways, it was a very interesting experience to do translation in that fashion. But other than that, I've always been very interested in language in general and, people's linguistic habits and, why they say certain things or why certain phrases are common in different places. And we had this languages society at Ashoka that I used to be part of. So even then, before I started doing literary translation, just being a nerd about language was always part of my everyday, I think. And as I did translation more rigorously and, got into it as a practice, I thought more and more and in much more depth about the intricacies of language. But then when it comes down to, how it has affected my teaching and stuff, I did like most of the teaching experience that I have is some in Ashoka and then some that I did during my master's in the US. And it made me engage with language in a way that sees it as this political and social entity. So I was teaching students English writing over there, but I had to grapple with the fact that there were many students in my classes whose first language was not English, many of whom were immigrants, many of whom did not speak English at home, and I don't speak English at home either. So teaching them English writing and like, setting a standard for what kind of English they are supposed to write and reproduce felt like doing the wrong thing to me because in the act of translation itself, I feel like we inherently acknowledge that there are so many different readings and so many different Englishes and dialects of a language that exist. And so that has shaped my teaching in sort of, restructuring the way I assess my students' writing and assess what is important in that they're doing. Is it important for them to produce a perfect English and to acknowledge the fact that they themselves are doing a process of constant translation when they are coming to college of this sort?
Really fascinating, Ipsha. And actually, I mean, I'm deeply, deeply interested in issues that you talked about in terms of language and
Mm-hmm.
these sort of hierarchies that we inherit, or the kind of ideologies we start inheriting around language, or the way correct language
Mm-hmm.
in quotes functions and things like that. So I am going to come back to this and talk about it. That's really fascinating. But I did want to
Mm-hmm.
ask, since you talked about your engagement with language, with a capital L, but also with the languages that you
Mm-hmm.
speak, that I wanted to understand your relationship with the Bengali language. And also, translation is a very, very close sort of a reading of a language. I think we've all been reading in certain languages. Once you translate, you really have to go deeper into that language and
Mm-hmm.
engage with it in a very different way. So I was wondering if this process of literary translation has in any way changed your relationship with the Bengali language, or maybe even with the English language, or just the languages that you speak and work with. How has translation changed your relationship with them?
No, thank you for this question because I think I haven't had the like opportunity to reflect on this specific thing so much before when talking about this book. But I think that the translation definitely has been very, has had a very important role to play in affecting my relationship with Bengali specifically. Because when I was growing up, and my, relationship with the languages that I speak is very mediated by my mother's experiences because she is the one who introduced me to reading and reading literature. And she herself is very, loves reading books and loves reading fiction. And that is why a lot of my relationship with language has been formed through reading fiction. But something that was significant that I remember growing up was that she was very insistent on having me read English books because when she was growing up, she did not have access to a lot of English books herself. And then neither did her parents, or neither did they have time to sort of, help her out with that. now that she sort of is an adult, or like when she was growing up and starting to get engaged in like the job service and everything, she felt this sort of shame around, not being able to speak proper quote unquote English. There was a lot of, like learning on the spot that she had to do, where she was working in offices and talking to other people in English and Hindi, and learning through that process how to speak properly. But Bengali, she is extremely well versed in. And I mean, she has read like an insane amount of Bengali fiction, I think. But she was very like particular that she did not want me to feel that kind of shame that she had about her, as she calls it, lack of proficiency in English. And I don't think she, even now really like gives importance to the amount of Bengali that she knows. So a lot of the literature that I read growing up was primarily English, and I was introduced to Bengali literature through reading in school because we had Bengali as a vernacular subject that we were studying in school. So when we were still in school, it was just not that interesting to me at all. I was not invested in the history and context of these, literary pieces and the language so much itself, even though I spoke it at home and everything. Only when I was in like higher classes towards the end of school did I start growing more of an interest, but I was still not, like an active Bengali literature reader. But then as I got engaged in the process of translation and just, like talking to other people who work on language and linguistics, I started to realize that there are so many things that are implicit in my experience of Bengali as a language that I've never sort of thought about, and what a curious language Bengali is. And there is so much about it that I haven't really, given consideration before. And it was only when I started translating, and especially translating Hidden Treasure, I think was a process that brought me more closely to the Bengali language, because it is such a colloquial book, it's not written in the language of, like the greats, like the great classic writers of Bengali. So trying to translate that kind of language really made me think a lot about what it means to be a Bengali reader and speaker. And so I think it has helped me deal with some of my own shame about not being proficient enough in Bengali, and sort of realizing that it's okay and I can sort of develop my relationship with all of these languages that I was born into in my own time. And I think translation has really helped me sort of grow into that process in a very organic way.
Thank you. That's yeah. Thank you for being candid about that. It's really fascinating to me that in our minds we sort of learn about Bengali, like the literary traditions in the Bengali language, and I think you imagine that the sense of shame and pride works very differently with the Bengali language. I think I've always imagined that there is a certain pride attached to speaking and reading the language, but I guess these post-colonial hierarchies come in any case, right? The sort of aspiration that's attached
Mhm.
to English or the kind of social status attached with that always ends up playing a role in this idea of shame and pride, I think, with language. So that's a really interesting,
Mhm.
yeah, thank you for sharing your personal experiences with that. I could keep talking about this because I'm really interested in this topic, but I do want to talk a little more about your
Mhm.
translation in Hidden Treasure.
Mhm.
You talked about the colloquialisms and in the way that it's been written in the original. And I also wanted to understand how you deal with a lot of very like culturally rooted themes in the book. So whether it's religion, caste, superstition, sort of engaging with women's struggles, financial hardships, all of these that come from a very cultural context. How do you convey some of these complex layers in the English language? Because you don't have the sort of luxury to kind of vary the language when you're translating into English. So how do you convey those complexities? And if you'd like, we can also maybe read a little bit from the text to understand a flavor of the way you've translated it as well.
Sure. I mean, I have, thought and thought about this, thing of like how did or what was the process of putting those words on paper. And whenever I think back to it, I think it was such a like unconscious or very like internal process in many ways, even though I was discussing with other people around me the what do you think this phrase should be translated as and that kind of thing. But I think that eventually the process of being able to render the complexity of a text in uh, a language different than the one it was written in comes down to being a really invested reader. Because I think that at the end of the day, translators are some of the best readers of literature out there. And for me, I think that capturing the complexity and the number of layers of, characters and character changes and arcs that are happening throughout this story, and then the other one that's also in this book, came down to reading that those stories over and over and over again. And even after I was done with one draft of the translation, I think I did so many drafts of it after that that I never, kept count of how many drafts there were by the end. And even now, I feel like when I open this book, I read through it, I feel like, oh, this could be changed, that could be changed. And I thought at some point that maybe I will stop feeling this way at some point. Maybe I will finally be satisfied with what I have produced. But I think feeling that way also comes down to the character of the book itself, like it really conveys the complexity of that book, because it's such a it's a book that is so deeply rooted in this woman's very internal feelings and desires and aspirations and her internal world, and the way that she is interacting with this very convoluted world of different kinds of social forces around her, that every single time you read it, it's such a, like, in many ways it's a very intuitive feeling, and sometimes it feels like language isn't enough to even capture the sort of flavor of that. I think that like the complexity of the text in itself really comes down to Shongita Pondopadhyay's credit of being able to convey something that is so layered in such simple language. And I think I tried my best by, reading that text over and over again and trying to sort of live within the skin of these characters in some ways. Um, I used to do a lot of like performance art things also once upon a time. And I think those things also feed into the way that I engage with any text to sort of, feel the character and feel their journey and story. And to think about and to sort of, read out the text aloud to myself and think of, okay, what is the tone that I am using to say this particular dialogue? And how do I, convey the same tone when I read this thing out in English? So it's a very embodied process for me, at least in some ways, I think. And I think it's also becomes kind of necessary when you're dealing with a text of the kind that Shongita has here. But I can read just a short section from chapter three, or no, actually chapter four of Hidden Treasure, if that is okay.
Absolutely, yeah, go for
Um,
it.
okay, so I'll just start reading. Sharburi and Shumantro returned from school around 4:15 or 4:20. When she saw her children, Chintamani realized she needed to appear calm, or people would definitely suspect her. In her efforts to compose herself, she suddenly turned on Sharburi. How many times have I told you to wash your own uniform and your brother's when you return from school? You only have two uniforms. Do you like wearing the same sweaty clothes every day? Really, Sharburi, you're 16 years old. Have you seen how much work girls in other houses do? And you? Either you're sewing all day or giggling with older girls in the neighborhood. She finished her diatribe and began to pant. She served her children's bananas mashed in chatu. Then she stood at the window and gossiped with Nipo Bithi from the next lane, telling her about Urmila. Nipo Bithi was the matron of a nursing home. She hadn't married and had a sharp tongue. She was almost an old woman now, having spent all her life trying to support her brothers' families. Although she'd never had much to be happy about, she always had a bright smile on her face. Chintamani felt a searing pain traveling up and down her back as she chatted. That was when Shonoka's piercing scream made Chintamani jump. She had to go running to the courtyard. There were no men in the house, only girls and women. Nearly all of them began weeping loudly on hearing Shonoka's description. Chintamani too sent her children into their rooms and went back to the window. They're saying Kali Shankar is lying dead, she told Nipobithi, shaking like a leaf. Nipobithi came over with her brothers at once. When Mollika's daughters returned, Chintamani brought them to her rooms as well. Chitra, Mitra, stay here until your mother comes back, she ordered. The police arrived at the house within an hour. A man named Kalishankar had been killed. He was about 35. No one knew his real name or identity. He'd been killed by strangulation. A man who had introduced himself as the distant cousin had murdered and left him. The room was in disarray, but they hadn't figured out what the man had been looking for so desperately. The murderer had brought a cloth bundle with him and had left without it. There were only pieces of polystyrene in the bundle, nothing else. The police suspected that the murderer had come to take a box of money or something similar from the man named Kalishankar. They also believed that these men could be linked to the group's smuggling idols of gods. They deduced this from the polystyrene pieces. They searched every nook and cranny of the house for idols or other precious objects, but found nothing. Harishankar must have removed everything from the house much earlier. Bolai Haldar, Porimal, Monmotho, Shadhan Babu, and Topen Babu were exhausted from going back and forth to the police station. But the police didn't arrest anyone. Their neighbors came to their rescue and gave witness. Earlier, too, Rajeshwari had allowed strangers to board in their house. Nearly everyone knew about her strong belief in palm reading, horoscopes, and all sorts of fortune telling and superstitions. And people didn't stop believing in such things just because they had been tricked by someone they trusted. That was how things were back then. Besides, people used to be generous. They never hesitated to offer shelter to someone who needed it. Several people believed if the gods have given us life, they will surely give us food. People would always end up in the places where God had ordained they would receive food. This doesn't mean people weren't selfish then, but the people you considered your own included both relatives and neighbors. Their generosity wasn't restricted to their 1,000 square foot homes like it is today. This was certainly a matter of pride. So I'll just stop here for now. But I'm curious to know what were your thoughts on that little section that we read out.
Thank you. I really enjoyed hearing it in your voice, first of all.
Mhm,
And no, I really enjoyed that. I think I really felt like, I mean, of course, I don't have access to the original at all, but I really did feel
mhm,
like some of those, I mean, for lack of a better word, complexities were really well brought out in the English as well. And
mhm,
um, yeah, like you've used some words here and there which also sort of give a flavor of the original as well, which I
mhm,
really liked, even in other parts of the book as well. And the thing that actually, like, it is also about my next question, which comes up, is about this sort of daily lives of women. And you sort of have
mhm,
captured this ordinariness of women's
mhm,
lives,
mhm,
which I wanted to ask you how that was to do for you, because it is a difficult thing to accommodate in translation. There's just a sense of everydayness or ordinariness, and especially within sort of women who are feeling suffocated in domestic spaces. And this theme keeps coming up, as well as, women feeling suffocated, but also this theme of insanity that keeps coming up in the book as
mhm.
well. And I wanted to ask you how you felt trying to bring that out in translation, if you can tell us a little bit about that.
I mean, conveying that ordinariness and yet having the sort of pace that the book has, I think again is something that I will, give Shongita credit for, definitely. She's such a, I think, masterful writer when it comes to writing women characters, especially. And honestly, if read the book in the Bengali, and I hope it feels the same way when you read in the English, there is this sense of, palpable suffocation that you feel from Chintamoni's very, like the sort of daily routine that she is bound into. She has, like she wakes up at a certain time every day. She must prepare food for her children, then her husband, then she does the chores of the day. And it is when this man called Kali Shankar who comes into the house that there are parts of her day that, start getting altered and changed in many ways. So like there is this one episode in I believe chapter 2 when Chintamani is taking like her regular bath outside, I think like in the backyard or something, which is where the like washrooms were in that house. And when she is doing that, she notices that this man Kali Shankar is observing her from the roof. And for a woman like her who is so, who does not have the luxury of living beyond her daily routine. And if she does, it is something that is going to be noticed definitely. Because everybody in the house is keeping track of, what the women are doing. So to sort of like create that connection between herself and Kali Shankar. It is the sort of her daily routine and the daily things that she does that she has to take advantage of, and she finds moments within those to sort of create this connection between them. So like when she is bathing in that courtyard, in the backyard, and she notices this man staring at her, it is through the way that she bathes that she almost sort of like creates the sort of like peep show, but is also being very coy and not letting him see everything. It's a very exciting sort of thing for her, and it's a exciting way for her to, like a very different way for her to, experience this shower that she takes every day. And then, when she goes upstairs to the roof every day to, hang, like washed clothes to dry, that is the only time that she can, go and sort of see Kali Shankar or be close to him. So it is through these things, through her daily routine, that she is, like through subterfuge, she is, putting in these, getting in these ways to interact with this man and to like live out some of her desires. And really, there is, no other way almost for her to experience the strength of her desire, because there is some other part in this book, where she tells her husband that, there are so many things that I wanted from you. I wanted you to take me to this place, that place for vacation. You never did that. You were always busy with your job. So, she has many unfulfilled desires, and it is this routine of the house that she is so bound into. But it is again this space that she sort of transforms into the space of her desire, or is compelled to transform into the space of her desire. And so that felt like a very interesting thing to me. Like there is so much that is happening within the four walls of these house, but at the same time that there is desire, there is also a risk to this desire that she is taking, and there's so many layers to it. And I think that really the way of rendering that comes down to producing it in the most authentic and human dialogue as possible. And so the section that I read out doesn't have a lot of dialogue in it, but you'll see in the other places that Chintamani as a character has a very sharp way of speaking, and she will bring that out very often. um, and that is where I think that all of the layers of this kind of experience comes out. And I mean, now that I look back on it, on this, hidden treasure, and then the other story that's there, the household, even that has a very sharp tongued female character. And I was thinking about how this theme of women going insane in stories is not, new to readers who have a sort of sense of, reading global literature. Like when we think of insanity in stories written by women, we're immediately reminded of a lot of Victorian era literature. I think Charlotte Perkins Gilman, The Yellow Wallpaper. These are all stories, and then some of Virginia Woolf's work. These are all stories where uh, they're talking about women who are either confined at home because they are deemed to, require rest and relaxation or rest cure. And then other women who have no rooms of their own and who are sort of, made to make do with the house that they are given. And that theme of women going insane from the sort of suffocation of living inside these four walls is something that has existed for so long. But whereas in these, like Victorian stories, it's like often these women have no voices. And they're often women who are belonging somewhere within the middle class or upper classes, which makes sense why they're often not allowed to speak. It's interesting to me that in the case of Chintamani, though she is a Savarna caste woman, she is living in the house of a Brahmin woman, and she herself is not Brahmin and is subject to some prejudices of caste herself, and then is also a woman who is definitely from a much lower class. And so the conditions of her class being and her caste being also require her to speak out in many ways and to reach out for survival in a way that we might not have encountered in other accounts of women's insanity in literature. And so I think it would always be interesting to sort of hold all of these stories together and think about, what is happening to women across the in this theme of insanity across so many different cultural belongings.
Thank you. That's a really comprehensive answer. And I was also thinking of this theme of insanity and women, and of course, Victorian
Mhm.
literature, like even Jane Eyre, for instance, with Bertha Mason and the attic,
Hmm.
all of those things. And
Yes.
it's very interesting that, for a translation, you don't just have to. Of course, everyone knows it's more than translating words from one language to another, but really, it is also about placing the text in a certain tradition or literary tradition, in a time
Mhm.
period. There's so much that's going on actually in the process. It's not just that one, conveying of a sentence from one language to
Mhm.
another. So, yeah, thank you
Yeah.
for putting it in context like that. It's really interesting to see it that way. And I also had another question about, how you decide. About how much to sort of, this whole idea of fidelity to the author's voice. How do you make
Mm.
decisions around that? How much do you decide that you want to leave some traces of the author's voice as it is, or how much do you want to sort of play around with it? How much liberty do you take? Do you think it's sort of better to work with the author closely, or do you think the author should maintain a distance from the translation process, and the translator should have some extra liberties or have their own space to work with it and then later discuss? So I just wonder how you feel. Um, what you feel about this relationship with the author and translator, what you think is the most ideal way to kind of translate, in that time. How much do you consult the author, look at ideas of authenticity, fidelity, all of these things, if you can talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I will, draw purely from the two experiences of translating that I have, because I think it's difficult for me to say that there should be one way in which all translations are to be done. I think that sometimes how much you consult the author comes down to, what the purpose of that translation is, and, what is the author's positionality. And I think it also depends upon the content of the book that you are translating. But in the two things of mine that are, published translations as of now, so Hidden Treasure is one of them, and then I co-translated a short story for the beloved book of Anticast SF. In both of those cases, I did not consult the authors at all. So in the case of Hidden Treasure, that I did as a class assignment to begin with. So there was no question of consulting the author at that point. But even in future drafts, I did not reach out to her because um, it's not, something that in one way was, like pointed out by my professor that this is something you need to do. But there was a point at which that, I got in touch with her via email and I sent her the manuscript and I was like, I thanked her and everything. And Shongita did reach back to me with some suggestions on, this word and that word should be changed. Or, uh, but I remember that like at some point I was like there was this particular like technical term that she was like, I don't think this is the term for it, that is the term for it. But then I checked the dictionary and saw that no, the term that I had used was the correct one. But I think what happens, when the author is reading their own translation, they are bound to fixate on things that the translator will not fixate on, and the translator will fixate on other things, because ultimately, the author has their own purpose in disseminating this piece of fiction, and the translator is ultimately a reader who is taking the effect of reading that piece of fiction and distributing it to the world in a larger way. And so sometimes I think that even if consultation is to happen between the author and the translator, I think it is important to remember that both of them are going to have very different perspectives, and you can't possibly accommodate all of that within the translation, because the author, I think, is going to, they're going to like look at the intricacies of things that they have said and think that these small details need to be rendered very carefully, when sometimes that can take focus away from the sort of like larger beauty and, like purpose of the translation. But even as I say that, I don't think that, you should never consult the author, because there are many, experiences that the author might have put into the or into the text that they have written that I may not have experienced myself ever. And I think I can, speak to this in like with an example from my second translation that I did, because so that was a short story written by the author Gautam Mondal. and it was like a short sci-fi story. And it was because it was published in the book of Anti-Caste SF. It was an Anti-Caste SF piece talking about, the experience. It was like a science fiction piece where this like sort of ideal human being is created with genes from every caste that there is. But in that process, there is a sort of, trivialization of caste that happens in that story. And me as a Savarna, like reader, translator, writer, all of those things, there are many experiences that I simply, will never understand or don't have the historical burden of, the trauma that comes with caste experiences in my own family. And so, if I were going blind into that translation without consulting the author at all, I think I would feel very, uncomfortable. That I would sort of think that I do still want to acknowledge the fact that there is a certain lens or there is a certain gap in the experiences between my own and the writers. But the thing that helped me was that my co-translator, who is also my friend, Protiti, they can speak to these experiences from their own lived experiences themselves. And having them on board was helpful in many ways because they had an interpretation of the story that, I could not have come up with simply because I don't have that kind of lived experience. And so, in some ways, I think that having Protiti as my friend over there helped, do some of the work that might have been required if I would reach out to the author. The author himself, wasn't available at that time, regrettably. But having Protiti there really helped me. And so, I think that it really comes down to a case by case situation. And if the translator feels that there are some experiences that they cannot speak to, or they don't have an adequate understanding of, then I think that consulting the author, falls well within, like an ethical thing that they should do.
Thank you for the very sort of thoughtful responses. I was at a translation event yesterday. It was actually connected with the Women
Mm.
Translating Women series. And the
Right.
translator was talking about how she translated an entire story thinking it was about boredom. It was about one person looking
Mm.
at the wall, staring at a wall, and she thought the whole story was about boredom. And much later, she realized that it was about a writer's block. So she had never sort of thought of those actions as something more than just sort of staring at this like fly that's on the wall. And so she thought it was about
Mm-hmm.
leisure and boredom, whereas it was about
Mm.
this character feeling this extreme sense of frustration and feeling a writer's block. So it's very interesting to hear about that sometimes, yeah, the interpretation can be completely different, but I guess sometimes that's okay as well. Like there are some people, maybe poets, would like some things to be open to interpretation, and then the translation has to kind of deal with that ambiguity as well. But yeah, you're right that it is a case to case basis sort of a thing. But it's interesting to think about how these relationships develop as well. And of course, only for those who actually have access to the author. So many times it's texts from the past that are dealing with and things like
Exactly.
that. So that's quite a different process. I wanted to ask something on a more light-hearted note, and I wanted to ask you if there's like any quirky habit or hobby that's related to your translation process that you might want to share. Something, I don't know, unique to you that you feel you noticed while you were translating. Is there something like that that you can think of that you might want to share?
I think that music is something that ties very closely into my writing and translating habits, any creative work that I do in general. And I found that when I am learning a new language, what makes it easier for me is to listen to music from that language. So, like I'd mentioned before, that often doing a translation is a very immersive experience for me. So, if I am translating something new, sometimes I will create a playlist, and I create playlists for any kind of thing almost in my daily life. I'm a chronic playlist maker, as I like to call myself. But when I'm doing a translation, then I'll sometimes create a playlist with Bengali songs that I think are sort of capturing the mood of whatever text I'm translating. And I will listen to that on repeat as I am doing the translation, or I will just listen to that as I'm walking around and trying to, sort of like figure out some, naughty, gnarly, some word that I'm having difficulty translating or rendering. So music really helps me sort of get into that space. Um, Other than that, I would definitely, this is not a habit at all, but this is just something that I do. I'll always call my mom, and talk to her instead of like sometimes, one consults a dictionary and, if you aren't, if you're struggling with a word, but my mom is my human dictionary. So I'll call her up and I'll tell her that there's this word that I'm struggling with. Can you tell me what it means? And like give me example of how you would use it in a sentence. Then I will understand how it is supposed to be rendered in the text. So those are things that really just sort of help me, like draw from things around me rather than from a dictionary to do that work.
How special. And yeah, how special to have a dictionary that's not just a word dictionary, but like a whole cultural sort of treasure trove. So that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I also want to know if there was any sort of, once this book has come out, is there any reaction or response to the book in terms of its reception? Is there something that surprised you or something that made you laugh, made you smile, something about the reception of this book, if you can tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I remember being very concerned, I think, because we discussed, the complexity of this text so much in today's conversation. And I remember being concerned about people being able to discern that complexity from the translation when they're reading it, because it seems like a very simple story at first read, but the more you read it and the farther you go in the story, the more you realize that there is so much going on beneath the surface. But I remember reading this one review of the book that really captured the sort of way that I felt about it, and the reason that I was drawn to this little novella so much in the first place, which is the sort of way that, desire, economic struggles, all of these things are coexisting together in the story and are not separate from each other. And the reviewer had really like been able to capture that and been able to detect that from their reading of the book. And that made me really happy in some ways, because I thought that this is like, I think somebody really gets, because you really just want somebody to understand that there's so much potential in this book that you have translated. Like for many people, it is obviously just going to be a fun leisure read, which is great. But then if somebody is, like being a translator of a book is in some ways also being a real nerd about that book. And when somebody, is able to understand the essence of your nerdiness or your obsession with that book, that is a great feeling. So that is something that I will remember fondly.
That's amazing to just feel sort of seen and heard, and just feel like someone gets it. I think that's a really big thing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. I do have another question about the translation, and we talked a lot about the complexities that you managed to convey in translation and all of these things. And I often struggle with this when I translate as well, and I work a lot with poetry. So there's this sort of awkwardness that comes into a text in translation, right? And um,
Mm-hmm.
how you do you think about it as again staying authentic to the original, trying to deal with that translation or the translatedness of a text, or do you think of this as a poem in itself? So I'm often sort of grappling with that, and I'm wondering how you balance this translatedness of the text with its cohesiveness as a piece of work as it exists, on its own today. So I'm wondering whether you face some of these challenges in navigating this sort of terrain between how translated should it seem and how independent maybe should it seem as a work in itself. So yeah, I'll hand that over to you and ask you what you think of that.
Yeah, I, have answered this question so many times in, talking about this book. And I think that my answer sort of evolves and updates itself every single time, because I keep thinking about this question. And I think reading Hidden Treasure, especially like, because I, ever since the book has been translated, I've never gone back and read the entire thing from the book itself. Because like whenever I read it, I have this like immense sense of like, oh God, like this thing, I feel like I could have written it this way. And I sometimes I just I'll be like, no, it's in print already. You can't do this. So I think that uh, that awkwardness you are like bound to feel when you are reading a text, and especially something like this particular one, and especially Shongita's, idiom of writing is very, very colloquial and very, context based in many ways, and that is not easy to render into English. Because I think that we as, Indians who have inherited, or inherited isn't the right term, who have grown into the English language in many ways, and, like have grown the English language from the soil anew in many different ways. Our relationship with it has always been, very complicated, because for a lot of people who, in the very early stages of English coming to India as a literary language, the people who were writing, let's say, some of the first like English novels and stuff, were often having to cater to readers who are not even based in India, because there weren't so many people reading literary English at that point in this country. And so that awkwardness of, thinking about like, okay, who exactly is my audience? Is it Indian readers? Do I have to account for readers outside of India as well? And how do I cater to both those audiences when I am writing? Do I keep the awkwardness or do I not? I feel like these are questions that, you can never completely resolve. But I think that, you are inevitably going to come up against some awkwardness even as you read the text yourself and read it aloud to yourself. Like even as I was reading that little section out for like a few minutes ago, the names of people that I'm reading out, I'm reading them out as, Bengali people would say it, as Bengali people would pronounce it. But then when I'm reading the English words next to them, then I'm reading them in the sort of Indian English accent, or, whatever is the right term for it. And so inevitably there is a sort of, dissonance between those things, and like your accent is bound to slip, and you can't, keep this perfect performance of reading the English perfectly and then reading the Bangla perfectly. There is going to be some slippage between those two things. And I think that perhaps I don't notice that awkwardness so much when I am reading translations from other languages, perhaps before, because I am not, familiar with that language itself. But I think I'm bound to notice these things when I'm reading like something in Bangla, especially because my relationship with this language is so lived in. And I don't know if there is, a way of settling that awkwardness ever. And for somebody who is perhaps, not Indian or is not familiar with this language, while reading it, they might sense that awkwardness as well, given that there are some natural differences between the source language and the target language. But I think that for me as a translator, the takeaway from it is to sort of be comfortable with the slippage that is happening there, and eventually see what I can make out of that slippage as I am translating. And then that's probably something that will take me a lot more translations to discover, but that is a journey that I'm excited to go on.
Very interesting. I think you've raised many, many different issues, and this whole issue of what kind of English to write in. I mean, there are
Mhm.
so many Englishes, and I think you put it really beautifully about how did you say it? You talked about sort of growing a new English from the soil. I think that's a really
Yeah.
beautiful sort of an image. And yeah, I think this is something that translators struggle with all the time in terms of what kind of English readers to target, because it's a very different kind of English that an Indian English audience would understand, and a very different English that you're then writing in
Mhm.
if you want to access a wider readership. And sometimes it can be frustrating to figure out, how to navigate that. But I think it's really interesting the way you've put it and the way you've explained that. So, thank you so
Mhm.
much for that. I think I've asked you a lot of sort of complex questions. So I did want to wrap up the conversation. But before I wrap up the conversation, in this new season of the podcast, I've started a new translation rapid fire round. And what this
Okay.
means is that I'll be asking you three very quick questions. And yeah, you can just say whatever comes to your mind first, and then we'll
All right.
wrap up the conversation after that. Okay, so I'm going to start the rapid fire. The first question is one Bengali word that you wish English had.
Shamol. This has always been my long standing, because shamol is a word that means dam, but in a very beautiful sort of it's more than just dampness. It's a affect in itself. And it is very related to the idea of, the color of the earth and the feel of the world after it has rained. And I don't think that English has any one word that can really capture that beauty.
Very interesting, and that was so quick as well. Great. The second question is music or meaning, what to retain in translation?
Music.
Okay. And the third question is one book that you wish you had translated.
Oh my God, there's so many. But I think something by Nobunita Dipshin, all of her work has mostly been translated, but she's such a fun writer and such a fun person to read. And I wish that I had gotten there first and gotten the chance to render some of that stuff.
Brilliant. Thank you for being a sport about this. I think the last thing I just want to ask you before we go is if there's anything that you're working on now, any other sort of translation projects, anything upcoming, because we'd love to hear about those as well.
I've got like little creative projects of my own going on. I'm currently working with two other collaborators on this Calcutta, like pre-modern Calcutta documentation project, where we're just going around and, documenting sites in Calcutta that date from before British rule, and also getting like documents and texts from before that time. So there's been some translation involved in doing that. But even though I've sort of like literary translation is coming in later, and I've been involved in doing a lot of translation every single day for like students of mine, because sometimes I've taught them Bengali text, but I've had to translate that beforehand. And I've really gotten interested in the idea of translating for educational purposes and educational texts. And I think that is something that I'm going to explore next in wherever my journey takes me.
Really fascinating. I'd love to know more about that, and I'm sure we can sort of keep talking about these things. But I hope that we'll
Mhm.
continue our conversations even beyond this podcast. But thank you so much, Ipsha, for being on Afterword Voices in Translation. And I really enjoyed speaking to you and hearing about your journey with languages, translation, literature. And you shared such interesting and personal anecdotes as well. It was very, very interesting to hear. And thank you for the reading as well. And yeah, I look forward to staying in touch and seeing more of your translation work in the future as well.